Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising on February 24th, 2023. As the world takes note that it was 1 year ago today that Russian forces entered into eastern and southern Ukraine to secure a land bridge to Crimea. There's been a lot of rhetoric, mostly in the Western press, about the importance of continuing to defend Ukrainians against the Russians, continuing to arm them now with advanced tanks and sophisticated weaponry. And at the same time, the director of the Commission for Foreign Affairs of the Communist Party of China, Wang Yi, has visited Russia, met with Vladimir Putin and the officials of the Russian military and Duma in preparation for a summit between Xi Jinping, the leader of China, and Vladimir Putin in the near future, making a statement that China stands in solidarity with Russia around Ukraine and in the defense of their national interests, as both superpowers, China and Russia, are experiencing escalating confrontation of a military nature with the United States. So on the first anniversary, as it were, of the war in Ukraine, what we are witnessing is an escalating conflict between superpowers. And that's the most fundamental fact that the world and each and every one of us needs to take in. This is not the United States attacking Iraq or Afghanistan or Panama or bombing the Balkans, which pitted a superpower against very small, weak nations. This war is pitting the United States and Russia and China against each other in an escalating conflict that has no other end but a nuclear exchange if it's not stopped. And a nuclear exchange will mean a Holocaust for humanity. The only analog that I can think of as a historian is the years preceding World War I, when the great powers of that time, England, Germany, France, Italy, the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, Russia, and the United States, lumbered into a war that nobody expected, for which nobody was prepared, but condemned the entire world into a 4-year carnage that left over 10 million people dead. If you've seen any of the movies or the footage or you've read about the war, there were celebrations, bands, marches, just like today, supporting our boys going to fight whoever it was that they were going to fight. Like today in the media, it's saturated with support for Ukraine as Ukraine defends civilization against the Russian hordes and a delusional megalomaniac called Vladimir Putin, when the reality is that nothing is farther from the truth. And if we don't stop this escalating war, we're going to blow ourselves up. And I want everybody to take that in. If we do not stop this war, the superpowers at some point are going to come into a conflict, the consequences of which are almost unimaginable. In 1914, it happened in an obscure little town called Sarajevo that most people didn't even know was on the map, when an archduke was assassinated by some nihilists in Yugoslavia. And a chain reaction began to take place until finally the carnage of World War I ensued. Historians to the present day don't know really why the war happened, other than it just happened because no one was paying attention to the larger picture. And it's the larger picture, as you all know, that I have been offering through my teach-ins and through comments here. And we're having a summit on Ukraine starting this next Monday, between the 27th of February and the 3rd of March, and again in April and again in June. The situation in Ukraine is the most critical issue confronting humanity today. Nothing is as important as stopping this war and engaging in diplomacy. Nothing. Because without stopping this war, none of the other problems confronting humanity, at the center of which is runaway climate change, will even begin to be dealt with by our governments and the international institutions that need to come into play. So right at the moment when we need to be cooperating with the Russians, cooperating with the Chinese, cooperating with the nations of the world and the peoples of the world, what are we doing? We're fomenting war. It's an act of insanity and an act of madness, maybe without parallel, certainly in modern history, certainly since the Second World War, a carnage that left over 50 million dead. So before we launch into our program, I want to just show a map so everybody gets an idea of what's actually happening in Ukraine. And it's very important for you to set aside all the messaging from the mainstream media. It's all propaganda. It is all there for your consumption, so you continue to support the war machine. So if you're supporting the war in Ukraine right now, you're supporting the war machine. And you need to ask yourself very deeply and very seriously whether you really want to do that, or whether you want to pause and look at the reality. I'll be posting another teach-in today and a blog, but I just want to show everyone a map. So we all take in exactly what is taking place. This is a map of Ukraine. And what you'll see that the Russians have done, they have not invaded Ukraine to take over Ukraine in some delusional grandeur of Vladimir Putin wanting to recreate the Soviet Union and take over Eastern Europe. What they have done is one of the most limited operations for any war in modern times. They have simply taken Eastern Ukraine, Southern Ukraine, in order to secure a land bridge to Crimea, which gives them access to the Black Sea, which they have to have as a great power, both to protect themselves and to enable trade with Europe and with the rest of the world. It's essential that people understand that this has not been an invasion. This has been a limited military operation as a defensive measure against US expansion in Europe. And I want to show another map because this is critical for people to understand if we want to in any way come to some kind of empathy with the Russians and with Vladimir Putin. This is can you see this map of Europe? Georg, is that coming through?
Yes.
Good. This was the Europe in 1990. After Gorbachev, the Russians withdrew from all these countries. This is the map of all the weapons that are now being deployed. And if you look at what the Russians are seeing, this is NATO, United States, Canada, Greenland, pushing into Europe, farther and farther to the east. This is Ukraine. This is what the United States is now trying to seize, along with the Republic of Georgia. And that's where the Russians said, no, we're not going to let NATO move further to the east. And this is Crimea. So you can see what the Russians have done. They've just created a land bridge to secure Crimea to protect their military operations there. But as I said, give them access to the rest of Asia. But if you look at what's going on from the Russian point of view, you've got the greatest empire, maybe in history, certainly the strongest, pushing further and further to the east with an intent that the neoconservatives have been articulating since the 1990s of seizing all of Europe and breaking up Russia. So if you're Vladimir Putin today, you see the United States and NATO pushing to the east, you know that they're talking about regime change. What would you do? What would you do if Putin does not secure Crimea? He goes down in Russian history as the greatest failure of Russian leadership, maybe in their entire history. The Russians were attacked by Napoleon in 1812, again by Hitler in 1941, and they endured, and the enemy was vanquished. They're now being attacked by the United States, and they're engaging in what I would call their last stand to protect the land bridge to Crimea. And if we don't understand the reality of what's going on, we're never going to be able to come to peace, because most of the people in Europe, in Western Europe, and in the United States are watching the same news, because you're getting the same message, whether it's on BBC or Deutsche Telekom, a television, or French TV, or BBC, or NBC, or Fox News, or MSNBC. It's one message: to support war. So on this anniversary, I take a stand against this war. And I will say that if we don't stop it, the consequences of an escalating exchange between superpowers is going to be catastrophic for humanity. That's what's true on the first anniversary of this war. And we need to take it in. And that's why we need a ceasefire. We need diplomacy. But most fundamentally, the United States needs to stand down. Ukraine should be neutral. The Ukrainians and the Russians were born together in Kievan Rus over 1,000 years ago in the 9th century. They're siblings, they're brothers, they're sisters. The Russians and the Ukrainians for over 1,000 years have interacted, sometimes fought, mostly cooperated. And for the last 300 years, since 1783, Russia actually controlled Ukraine, controlled all that area, including Crimea. So if the United States would withdraw and NATO would withdraw, the United States can have all of Europe. That's the single most important geostrategic fact of our time. The United States has now taken over all of Europe. Europe is now a vassal state of the United States. And now they're trying to seize Ukraine. Ukraine should be neutral. The Ukrainians and the Russians can work out whatever it is. And if you look at what's going to happen, the United States is going to consolidate control over all of Europe. Ukraine needs its sovereignty. And you can see by the map, it's still the largest country in Europe. Russia needs its access to Crimea. And if the world would just honor what the map indicates, which isn't going to change much, the world could engage in the diplomacy of peace. Russians and Americans have done it many, many times before. They can do it again. But we have to stop the war machine in the United States. And that means we all need to wake up to the propaganda that's being spewed out of our media 24/7, 365. So it's up to the Americans to wake up. And I would just say that what I've been saying for over a year is essentially the essence of the Chinese peace proposal. That there needs to be a broad security framework. Ukraine needs to be neutral. We need to honor the reality that the Russians have annexed that land bridge to Crimea. That is not going to go away. They're going to defend it with nuclear weapons if necessary. But Ukraine also needs its sovereignty, its own access to the Black Sea through Odessa. So if you look at the Chinese proposal, it's a common sense proposal. It's the obvious way forward. And we need to understand that. We also need to know that the United States and NATO are going to not even talk about it, because they're caught up in the war machine, just like the United States was in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in about a dozen other countries since 1990. The same people that brought us to war in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria are at play with the war in Ukraine. And the big lie then was weapons of mass destruction. And the big lie now is that Russia wants to invade Eastern Europe and destroy civilization as we know it, and that Vladimir Putin is a psychopathic megalomaniac. Nothing could be further from the truth. We need to stop the war. We need diplomacy, or the consequences are going to be unimaginable to everything that we think of normalcy. And I recommend everyone to watch my teach-in. It'll be teach-in number 3, along with the blog. I'll continue to speak out on this, and we'll be exploring many points of view next week in the summit on Ukraine that we're honored to be co-sponsoring and co-producing with Code Pink and a growing coalitions of groups who are beginning to speak out and march and protest about this war. So thank you, everyone. That's the day in which we find ourselves for Humanity Rising's session. We'll turn in a moment to a dialogue with Robert Thurman, who's a leading Tibetan Buddhist scholar and deeply versed in the history of Tibet and China, and in some ways, what has happened in Tibet is a distant mirror. So we'll take that up after our breathing. I know I've made some strong statements, and sometimes the truth needs to be piercing so that we wake up to the reality of what's actually taking place and the dangers of sleepwalking into war. Georg, let's play the sounds of the notes that will enable us to breathe as one. When you hear the first bell, breathe in. When you hear the second bell, just breathe out. And we'll take 10 breaths together, and then we'll commence our dialogue with Robert Thurman. I want to welcome Robert Thurman to the program, everyone. And we're going to begin our dialogue today by just rehearsing what happened in Tibet after the Chinese Revolution in 1949. And then, of course, beginning in 1950, 1951, they invaded Tibet and exacted what is arguably a genocide against the Tibetan people. So we're going to explore what happened. And then we're going to explore, how the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan community processed that as they were forced to flee, and what apology and compassion has come to mean for the Tibetan people. And then we'll discuss it more broadly, because obviously Robert Thurman is one of the world's leading experts on Tibetan Buddhism and Eastern mysticism. So welcome, Bob. And you know Tibet well, you've been there many times. So tell us that story.
Right. So the story is a very sad one, and it is still continuing, unfortunately, under who I jokingly refer to as Emperor Xi. and still is going on. Unfortunately, they're doubling down even, I would say, and I'll explain that. But what happened is that Mao, following the footsteps of the nationalists, actually, who started that, they started to, although they had rebelled against the Manchu Empire, which was the so-called Qing dynasty, which people only think is a Chinese dynasty, but actually the people who were humiliating the Chinese were not the British or whoever it was landing on the borders. Okay, I'm doing a recording. Please don't beep me. And was the Manchus, who are non-Chinese. They're like the sort of the Algonquians, and say the Chinese are the Cherokees or something. They're like a different people. And they had conquered China in the 17th century, in the 1640s. And they maintained a very strict rule over the Chinese, actually, and they humiliated them plenty. And they were quite a bit cynicized by being there for 300 years, but a little less than 300 years, but they were really doing that. So then after the nationalists rebelled against them, and they called on the Uyghur people, the Turkish Uyghur people in in Western, what is now Western China, but in those days was in Turkestan, Eastern Turkestan, the Mongolian people and the Tibetan people, to join them, plus another couple dozen what so-called minorities, to join them, the Chinese people, in overthrowing the Manchu Empire, and which they did. But then, unfortunately, the nationalist rulers decided that they would like to have the territory back that the Manchu Empire owned as a kind of protectorate, like the Mongolias, all the way up to Siberia, actually, the different Mongolian nations, and then the Tibetans and the Mongolians. So the nationalists tried to pretend they owned Tibet, they tried to pretend they owned Turkestan, and so on. And they went back and forth like that until Mao took over, again, rebelling against the nationalists, who fled to Taiwan, right? Chiang Kai-shek. And then Mao started trying to recreate the empire in the sense of territory. So he grabbed back all of Inner Mongolia, and he never acknowledged that Outer Mongolia had been separated from nationalist control in Yalta by Chiang Kai-shek under pressure from Churchill and Stalin. They never admitted that, so they don't agree with the existence of Outer Mongolia, actually, the Chinese still today. They conquered Eastern Turkestan, and that's Uyghur, where the Uyghurs are presently being wasted. And they invaded and conquered Tibet. And they presented it to the world that they were liberating the Tibetans. And then in the UN, nobody really knew what Tibet was. And so the Indians and the British, but following the British cue, they didn't really call China out for breaking the UN thing. And also remember, the communists were not in the UN. The Taiwanese represented China in the UN, that is to say, the nationalists who had fled there. So the invasion of Tibet was claimed immediately by the PRC, the communist Chinese, as an internal matter, but not the UN not to involve with. And so they wouldn't, and the British, one day the guy said, oh yeah, that's not an internal matter. Tibet is its own country. And the day after he said, oh no, I just heard from London it's more complicated. And they've been going on with this more complicated, all the rest of the nations in the world, colluding in the genocide of the Tibetans. So then the Chinese marched in. When they marched in, they tried to fool everybody, even the Dalai Lama, who almost fled to India at that time in 50, and having been anointed the leader of the country at the age of 15, and then almost fled, but then the Chinese sort of pretended they'll let Tibet remain Tibet, and they'll do this, and they started making roads, and because it was not that easy to conquer Tibet because it's so tall, so high, and there's not much oxygen for your Chinese troops who grew up at sea level. So they fooled them by pretending to be nice from 51 to 59, except in the East. In Eastern Tibet, they started confiscating people's property and collectivizing and doing more radical things fairly soon. So therefore, the Eastern Tibetans, who were pretty wild anyway, more tribal and more nomadic, they resisted, and they began to have guerrilla fighting. Dalai Lama never asked them to do guerrilla fighting, because in Buddhist ethics, if you're invaded by a foreign country, it's not, and you're the ruler or you're the leader who's responsible, you're not allowed in Buddhist ethics to resist that invasion if you couldn't succeed. Actually, if you could succeed and thereby minimize the violence of occupation and potential genocide, you should resist, actually. So there's no holy war thing in Buddhism, but there is a legitimate self-defense if you're capable. But you're not supposed to do it if you're not really capable. And you just would, you would just commit, it would be like suicide, for the people who fought. And then you would kill some of the invaders, and then they'd be even worse in their domination and occupation of you. So there is a kind of rule in Buddhism, Buddhist ethics like that. They always in the nonviolent attempt to minimize violence under invasion. So Dalai Lama never called for that. But the Eastern Tibetans did rebel from like 51 through the 70s, actually, until 71, for about 20 years. And they were somewhat, during the 50s, under Eisenhower, they were somewhat supported, but very, very minimally. And they were sort of denied that it was even happening, sort of thing. So it never really went anywhere, as the Dalai Lama knew it wouldn't. And he actually stayed from 51 to 59, instead of fleeing in 51. He stayed to try to get along with the communists. I thought maybe he was fooled, maybe, or for whatever reason he tried to do his best. Even went to see Mao in Beijing, and all this says he was brainwashed by them. But then by 56, he had realized from getting news from Eastern Tibet that they were ruthless and completely would annihilate whole villages and slaughter even the animals and the dogs, and that they really just wanted the territory, and they didn't really want the Tibetans. He realized that. So from 56, he sort of was on his way out, but it didn't actually make it. Nehru wouldn't let him stay, actually. He went in 56 for a brief visit to India on the 2500th year anniversary of Buddha, but Buddha's nirvana, but then Nehru wouldn't let him stay. Zhou Enlai went over and told Nehru, he has to come back. We need him. He's our head of our committee and blah, blah. So then Nehru made him go back. And also he wanted to go back to finish his studies in Tibet and get his PhD, which they call Geshe degree, teaching degree in Tibet, and which he did in 58. And then the 59 thing happened, where they were using him as bait to try to finish off the last of the Tibetan resistance. But he managed to escape before his whole house was shelled and everything. They blasted with artillery. And then ever since 59, the Chinese, in one wave after another, have tried to eliminate the Tibetan culture with a kind of ethnocide. But I invented the word, I call it ethnocide. It's like ethnic cleansing, but I make a word of ethnocide. And then in various times, they practically did genocide. But the idea being, they felt forced to do it. And because then later, of course, they became the UN people after the visit of Nixon, right? So they always wanted to pretend that it was their internal thing, and Tibet had never been a separate country, which is simply contrary to history. It was a protectorate of the Mongolian Empire when it ruled China, and the Manchu Empire when it ruled China. No Chinese dynasty had ever owned or even been a protector of Tibet. They had supported indirectly, made offerings to Buddhist teachers who were considered great in Tibet, but they never had any influence in the local government. And the protectorates of both Manchu Empire and Mongolian Empire, when they were conquering China over Tibet, were just protectorates, just that. And actually, they were supporting the Tibetan Buddhism to help them in the process of calming the nomads, the Mongolians and the Turks, who the Chinese were always afraid of. They were not really afraid of the seafaring, Westerners until too late, really, actually, until lately, last century. So that was so then Chinese are kind of compelled to try to crush the Tibetan culture. And of course, the communism is against religion, and the Tibetans were very strongly Buddhist. It was the mainstream Buddhist country in the whole Buddhist world. By mainstream, I mean demilitarized, since the 17th century was effectively demilitarized. Having been a conquest culture before that, and very strongly in the first millennium, they were massive conquerors. But they switched around because of Buddhism and became mainstream in the sense that nobody wanted the military profession. There were no Rambos, etc., except a few wild cowboy nomads in the far east of Tibet. Otherwise, the Tibetans took the monastic, career as the highest one in the culture, to conquer your own inner hatred, delusion, and confusion, and greed, and so on. And that was the purpose of human life as the mainstream purpose of the country. No other country has ever equaled a 20% monastic population as Tibet, which accounts for its high degree of education and high degree of literacy and high degree of amazing people. Not everyone, of course, but a high degree of that. So China, because of wanting to continue to claim that it didn't invade anybody when it took Tibet, is forced to try to destroy the culture. And it would remain sort of invisible because of the two-facedness of the British in Hong Kong initially. And then after that, they didn't want to admit that they had misled the world about the true nature of the Tibetan culture and the Tibetan people. You know, the Churchill personally prevented the 13th Dalai Lama in the 1920s from presenting Tibet's credentials to the League of Nations, for example. It goes back that long, the British two-faced thing that they've done. And we followed them in that, except lately, because of the 14th Dalai Lama, some of our congresses have passed resolutions about the freedom of the Tibetan people, and people have sort of learned about it. But in government diplomatic speak, they still have this two-faced thing. Yeah, well, that's China's internal problem, you know. And the Taiwanese used to support that because they used to pretend they owned Tibet. You know, the nationalist government, when they were pretending they owned all of China from Taiwan. And but they've dropped that election in the last 20 years. Fortunately, the Taiwanese are ready to call out the communist government for the Uyghurs, the Mongolians, the Tibetans, and Hong Kong now, you know, in their wish to not be completely under the PRC, and the untrustworthiness of treaties and guarantees one country, two systems to Hong Kong, you know, that the PRC imperium makes is just not trustworthy. So they are very, you know, and yet they know they can't claim independence, so they'd be bombed into smithereens by the vanity of those kind of rulers. So just like Putin and Ukraine, you know, where the Tibetans, now the Tibetans are very supportive of the Ukrainians because it's a similar thing where the big one is trying to pretend the little one doesn't exist as a separate people or nation or territory, and it's just trying to destroy them, you know. But they have the ability to resist that, and they are doing so. And that's really important that we see that, you know. I remember the figure from, of course, from a neocon, Jane Kirkpatrick, but it was a true figure. I checked it, which when she was alive, she told me this once, in one of our few meetings, that more people in the 20th century were actually killed by their own governments than were killed during the world wars. By enemy governments. So these sort of leftover empires where you have, you know, the racist thing and the cultural superiority thing, and yet they're supposed to make the other country the same, the minority country the same, and anything that's different about them you try to crush. It becomes kind of ethnocidal at first and then genocidal. And that's really what's going on. It's not the fault of the ordinary Chinese person who themselves for thousands of years love Buddhism and think of even today Tibet as a kind of Shangri-La. They have their own fantasy about Shangri-La, about Tibet, the Chinese. They have a version of that. They call Tibet Shizang, the Western treasure house, you know, where there are jewels. And they sort of now think of mining, of course, water, clean water. But in the old days, they thought of the jewels of the Dharma. Sorry, so the Tibetan, under the Dalai Lama's leadership, are still performing a kind of miracle as an exile community of 150 or whatever. There's no exact count. Probably worldwide is probably 200,000 by now. About 120 originally escaped, and they've multiplied and thrived in various countries. And they still, although some of the super young ones, a few of them, oh, I wish we'd had some guns, or I wish we could have been like the Ukrainians. There will be ones feeling like that. And Buddhism caused us to be nonviolent. That's why we couldn't defend ourselves and so on. But actually, mostly they have aligned behind the Dalai Lama that they have to, you know, while not forgetting that the many family deaths and many people tortured and killed, and still today, many people imprisoned. If a school teacher speaks up today in Tibet, and there are dozens of them in this situation, we want to teach our children in the Tibetan language medium, they will be arrested for sedition. It's not only we love the Dalai Lama or we want to practice Buddhism. They pretend, yeah, you can practice, go and burn some incense, but you can't learn anything, even the monks, who they leave there in a few monasteries for tourists, but even Chinese tourists, but they don't let them really learn of the mental freedom that the Buddhism seeks to convey to people. So, because they're absolutely bent on never having their basic lie exposed, which is that they do not own Tibet. They have no internationally law sanctioned legal ownership of Tibet. They really don't. because there has never been any kind of plebiscite, never any self-determination for Tibetan people. And in a world where self-determination kind of vaguely hovers as a human right, but isn't quite supported by everybody because these leftover empires want somebody else's territory here and there. So the world they're still two-faced and hypocritical in the diplomatic level. But still, it is actually, ever since Wilson, it has been, since the world wars, it has been a human right, actually. And actually, from the modern environmental point of view, it's essential, because if a faraway capital can dictate policies like cutting forests, like Bolsonaro in Brasilia cutting the Amazon, for example, or, the Brezhnev destroying the RLC by drawing too much water off for his cotton quotas, in other places, and other kinds of, and the Chinese imperium has wrecked the Yellow River, where there's hardly a trickle left to get into the Yellow Sea because of they're drawing off of its things, and they're mismanaging the plateau to melt the glaciers too fast, which is what they've been doing. So in other words, that the local communities be more self-determined, and indigenous people have more say even in those countries where that situation applies, is really critical to preserving the environment, because the GDP-oriented governments are going to support commercial exploitation of everything, of course, for their numbers, and they'll keep destroying the environment, which is what we're doing, and now it's affecting the whole planet. So Tibetans do that now. In this light, it's a miracle, as I say, that as a whole, the Tibetans are still following what's called the Dalai Lama's middle way policy, which is not calling for armed revolution, not calling for armed resistance, admiring the heroism of some guerrillas who did fight and die. But the Dalai Lama did not ask the country to rise ever. He never did. And because he's against the ethic, he knows the Buddhist ethic, and that is, if you can't do it, you don't have the means, you just shouldn't, and you should just try to be, calm down the invader, not to destroy you. And there have been moments like Deng Xiaoping after fall of Gang of Four in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping managed to control the government for a decade or more. During the early part of that decade, maybe for 5 or 6 years, he allowed Tibetans to rebuild monasteries, to openly own a rosary without being arrested, to say Om Mani Padme Hum. And he was trying to lure and he allowed the Dalai Lama, the exiles, government in exile, to send in groups that survey the situation to see if maybe Dalai Lama would return, and they could really trust the Chinese to let them live in their own way culturally and with their own spiritual traditions and so on, and educational traditions. And of course, after 3 or 4 embassies surveying the thing, from which we have a lot of videotaped evidence of what actually the Chinese did there in the early 80s, it was impossible. Then Deng Xiaoping had been misinformed by those administering Tibet about that the Tibetans were all happy socialists, or something, when meanwhile they were completely being totally ripped off and totally tortured, and lots of them killed and imprisoned, and really horrible stuff. And they were dying to get free, in fact. But they were praying to His Holiness, and they were still following. They weren't trying to rise in any guerrilla thing, so they were. But anyway, during that time, they allowed the culture to flourish again. And then sometimes they'll claim outside that we're support Tibetan culture, but actually, let me give you one example. In recent talk of a party boss in Lhasa, Chinese party boss there, he proclaimed proudly that he could announce in the past 2 or 3 months 2,785 mixed marriages of Chinese men and Tibetan women, which they do because Chinese physicians know through studies that someone born of 2 Chinese parents who live at sea level or nearer to sea level cannot thrive year-round in the 47% oxygen Tibetan plateau average altitude. It's not possible. They have to leave 3 or 4 months a year, or they get chronic mountain sickness, CMS, chronic mountain sickness, which is like acute mountain sickness, but it's chronic. Heart disease for men, and inability to gestate a baby in a womb for a woman, form placenta out of that oxygen. So that's why Tibet was relatively empty, that huge plateau, all these millennia, and Chinese weren't there already by the zillions, since they have that kind of high population rice culture that they have and good cooking. And they couldn't get there because they couldn't do it. But however, a Chinese man and a Tibetan woman, they can, perhaps the immediate generation could live there year round, or his or her children could live there. So it's an acceleration of the multi-generation it takes to really acclimatize lung chemistry to live healthily on 47, thrive, let's say, on 47% oxygen, which the Chinese medically know that. So if a government, now it might be the Tibetan woman would fall in love with the Chinese guy who's up there as a settler in some way, that's fine. But for a government to be encouraging that and claiming that as progress, while grabbing the children and having them only learn Chinese and not Tibetan, I mean, that's genocide. That fits the definition. And not to mention huge prisons like the Uyghur things, and what's really, in a way, good for Tibet, but it's not really registering yet in the world community. The Uyghur torture that they've been doing, and where they even proclaimed publicly that they were going to cure the Uyghur people who are Turkic racially of Islam. They're going to cure them of Islam, like Islam is a disease. They actually openly stated that about them, and luckily there's like 1 billion Muslims outside, and they are not going to stamp that, whereas there's not 1 billion Tibetan, Buddhists outside at all. So they're not in the same framework. But the fact that that's the behavior. Now, I have one redeeming thing about the Chinese imperium, because it's my last fantasized hope about some of the top people. The Chinese have an organization called the United Front Work Department, which has, I believe, I've been told, and I can't, some sinologists might quibble, but I've been told has 400,000 iron rice bowls. That is to say, has 400,000 decently paid employees to manage all the 55 minorities, major ones being Mongolians, Tibetans, and Uyghurs, and even Manchurians, who are sort of invisible because they so much hide and they act like Chinese, but they are actually still a different group. But anyway, that United Front Work Department, I feel, is not really properly controlled by the Politburo. I think and so they can do what they want with the minorities. And they are the ones who have been torturing the Uyghurs so spectacularly, and of course the Tibetans also for generations. And there's a thing where they dictate policy to the State Security Council within China and the Politburo. They don't obey them. And my evidence for that is only that it's a PR idiocy on the part of the leadership of the PRC to treat the minority nationalities in a colonialist manner, a genocidal and colonialist manner. And especially the Belt and Road Initiative, which is Xi Jinping's signature thing, to get to Europe and to unify Eurasia with a forceful Chinese economy, which is a dream, for any Chinese government. He's going through millions and tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of Muslim people, all the way to Turkey, and Persia. And yet he's now forced in the position of he's going to cure the Uyghur Muslims of Islam as if it were a disease. And how does he expect to make deals? Yeah, he can pay off some dictators for a while, like Erdogan and a few other people, the guy in Kazakhstan and others. But long term, that's like fatal for China's policy of wanting to be accepted as a major economic power in a rules-based international order and blah, 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 That's suicide for them. So it pushes him back into trying to, since people have pretty much given up communism in China and they know about capitalism and the disparities, inequality of wealth, and they're all out to get rich, is glorious, has really been the rule since Deng. And therefore he has to be a democratic, industrial, but moderately a non-planetary destroying industrial power, trading with everybody, and then everybody will be happy. And he'll be acceptable as that. Sure, they're hard workers and they're smart people. And why shouldn't they be like, as good as the Europeans? Fine. But if they act colonial and torture and they behave like Putin themselves, it won't wash, And they're not ready to conquer us all yet. We're not ready to be conquered quite yet, all of us, So anyway, that's the thing. So then to switch to the apology thing, actually in the Tibetan Buddhism, if you're harmed by an enemy, the enemy is considered to have done you a good deal. It's really helped you in the purpose of your human life because he's made you suffer. And if you can use that suffering to develop your patience to the degree where you would rather die than become hating anybody, the only thing you dislike is hatred itself, he's done you a benefit. Now, that can only fly, of course, in a culture where multiple lives is a normal thing, just like in San Rafael there, you have the Highway 101. Do you know what I mean? It's not a mystical belief that the highway down to San Francisco across the Golden Bridge is still there for a Marin County resident. It's just a normal, common sense belief. So in the Buddhist culture, that's a common sense belief. It's not a mystical thing. It doesn't even require proof. It's so obvious, actually, to them, that there's continuity in nature. And also, newsflash, they do know the amazing thing, which our modern materialists seem to have not managed to understand for all their Nobel Prizes in science, which is that it's my favorite thing nowadays, scientifically, nothing is actually nothing. Meaning nobody can go there when they just by dying. There's no place to receive you because it's not a place, nothing. It's actually nothing. It's not a dark space where you can sleep for eternity, And so instead of asking me, as my natural science friends have all these years, what proof do you have about future life, blah, 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 former life? It's the shoe is that other foot. What's your proof that nothing is there waiting for you or that you came from it? Nothing. It's a completely irrational, blind faith belief in nothing, which is a kind of insanity, actually, which I think is at the heart of our culture's inability to save our environment that we have to live in. I think that's the heart of it, actually, is because it makes you think that however nasty you behave and even feel, hence you can blow your brains out. That'll save you from a little embarrassment or a little shame or a little something. And because dying is becoming anesthetized. They're holding out that fake promise, which has no scientific grounding whatsoever, and is actually insane to believe. But never mind, I don't want to rant or rave about it. But I'm only saying it in terms of the idea of forgiveness and apology, that obviously if someone kills you, in a materialist sense, there's no forgiveness. And it's really a horrible thing they did. It almost has absolute status because all you are is your body. You don't have a spiritual continuum. So therefore, they prevented you from existing. But luckily, you're anesthetized by dying. So you don't mind because you don't realize it happened, which is, I think, part of the reason that materialists have been just as bad as religious fanatics. And they're based on just the same kind of irrational, even a worse irrationality, possibly. I could argue to Sam Harris, for example, the materialists are, by pretending everyone's anesthetized. If we blow up the whole planet, Death Star comes and blows it up. The Death Star that we've created, carbon cloud, and ruins the whole, California. Everybody has to escape to British Columbia, at which they'll be putting up a fence, believe me. It won't work. So anyway, so the forgiveness thing in that light comes in the process of cultivating transcendent patience, where it becomes impossible for you to hate because you realize hate is tearing you apart. It's like the person harmed you in the past, some really horrible way, and now you are harming yourself by hating that person who may even be dead, and yet you're hating them, and that's part, and even you might feel it's your duty to hate them. You're betraying your ancestors who got killed in them. Now let's look at the Holocaust, any kind of Holocaust, and especially that one. And you're betraying them if you don't hate the people who committed it. But actually, of course, you 100% can disapprove of them. If you're in a position to prevent them from doing it ever anywhere, you should, and people should remember it for that purpose. But personally, if you let your own life be twisted by holding hatred in your heart all the time and kind of projecting the possibility on everybody else, so to speak, and or justifying you're treating other people badly because your ancestors were treated like that, and you therefore suspect others might do it to you, so you preemptively torture them, all of those things are just maiming yourself, basically. So it's very pragmatic, the Buddhist thing. Forgiveness, the first beneficiary of forgiveness of even the most heinous thing is the forgiver, not the person who is forgiven, because actually they did a harmful thing, which is really bad for them in their own, evolutionary karmic connection. Do you know what I'm saying? And that goes on endlessly, good or bad. It doesn't stop at death. It's not automatically wiped out by nothing, because nothing has no causal impact on anything, because it isn't anything, right? So that's the forgiveness thing, and therefore a person who did do harm, and who even should, if they're still alive, of course, should not only apologize, but they should be doing everything possible to undo that harm. And even I would say the relatively, we imposed on the Germans and the Japanese. I don't know what we managed to do with the Italians, Mussolini people, because we did have Bertolucci there still. But anyway, the Germans and the Japanese, we imposed a really good democracy. We forced them, the German industry has done so well because we forced them to have workers' unions representatives on the boards, corporate boards, to represent the unions workers right on the board, et cetera, not shareholder versus worker, you know what I mean? So we forced a kind of stakeholder economy, and therefore they've had really great success, both of them, industrially speaking, and they also didn't have the burden of having to produce weapons all the time, neither country up until now, anyway. And as I said, the Italians, I don't know, we were into their fashion industry or something. We didn't bother with them. I don't know what happened with the Italians, but they are so happy people anyway, and they make great food. So, but the thing is, so that shows that people who are living in apology, which they did. If you go in reunited Germany in the Brandenburg Gate or whatever it's called, right there, they have a huge, amazing Holocaust museum. It's really fabulous. I'm sure you've been there. You go down and you go in to see all these horrendous things that happen, and it really makes your heart bleed, and it should. And we should have more of them everywhere. We have them, and we have them in Washington. We have them everywhere, and we still have idiots running around pretending it never happened, even in our government, which is really puzzling me. I cannot understand, Jim. I know it's a little bit of other context, but I really can't understand why we have no enforcement mechanism for people who have obviously and publicly broken their oath of office to support the government and the Constitution, and yet are pretending to serve the people through the government, and having broken their oath of office.
Absolutely.
And it just completely taken their pledge rather to Grover Norquist rather than the oath of office, rather than to the people of the United States. How they can still sit in there inside the government. They should be frog walked. I mean, it's not illegal. They don't have to serve in the government just because they're elected. If they decide they don't like the government anymore, they can go and oppose the government. But you can't do that inside the government because you have an oath of office. Except somehow the framers, did they not put any kind of examination as to whether you're keeping your oath of office or not? I don't know. That's really puzzling to me. 147 of them, after the invasion on January 6th, voted not to certify the election. That would mean automatically they should resign, because they can't take in good conscience their oath of office. And the oath of office, when you take it, it says, I take this freely without purpose of evasion or reservation. It says that. So since they can't say that honestly, publicly acknowledging it, how are they still there? Do we have an answer for that? So far, I haven't found one.
Well, I think part of the answer is there's no strictures in the law that mandates their removal, because I think the founding fathers probably didn't conceive that anyone would storm the Capitol, and anyone sitting as a member of the House of Congress after it's being stormed, would still deny the election. That's kind of an inconceivable
I know.
thought. But
or even signing, if you sign Grover Norquist's pledge that you'll never raise tax even to save, and now this debt ceiling crap is just going to be coming up now. But if you've signed the pledge to uphold the faith and good credit, it even uses that word, of the Constitution, how can you then do this debt ceiling thing and threaten to crash the government? Anyway, never mind. I know that's not the topic.
But I think the connection, Bob, is that what you're speaking to in the U.S. Congress, January 6th, is a delusion of mind, and I think that's fundamental to the Buddhist notion, hatred, greed, and delusion, right? It's possible, and we see it in what you just described, a collective delusion of the mind. And I think it gripped China when they invaded Tibet. It gripped Germany, and they went off the cliff of the National Socialists, so that you see in current events the profundity of the Buddhist insight that hatred, greed, and delusion are what binds us to these karmic actions of both self-destruction and the destruction of others. And that's why
that even holds for non-Buddhism, for Christianity, Judaism, where they believe that God is goodness, and yet when they do hatred and delusion and this kind of thing, they are denying their faith. So that's like their delusion is not to believe in goodness, in a way, you could say.
Let me ask you this, since you know the Dalai Lama probably as closely as certainly anybody from the Western mind, being the first Western or American monk to be initiated into the priesthood by him.
59 years of hanging out with the good man, and I'm still a Jew.
Well, how would you
on weekdays?
How would you understand the evolution of his consciousness in relationship to Tibet and his relationship to his capacity to be continually compassionate?
I know. Well, precisely because he doesn't hate even Mao. He even admires him in a certain way, maybe the young Mao before he became so violent and corrupted by power. But he, with his sort of humanistic, ideology that the idea of sharing wealth, the animating idea in Marxist thing, against capitalism, not the violence with the barrel of a gun and all that, but the other thing. So a little bit seeing that as similar to the Buddhist ideal or Christian ideal or any spiritual ideal of compassion and loving and reciprocity and empathy and all that. So, but anyway, the point is he knows they went evil, and he's seen, like blood storms, like Putin is today inflicting on the Ukrainian. And he's seen that, but he doesn't hate him. He absolutely wants to stop it in whatever way he can, but he doesn't hate it, doesn't hate anybody. Which in a way means he recognizes that any egotistical person can be turned to the dark side if they don't know better what reality really is, that there's no need to turn to any dark side to perceive happiness, which is what everybody wants. Even evil people want that. But the more evil they do, the more wretched they become, actually. In fact, they might pretend, I'm so powerful, I feel great, but they don't. Actually, they're frightened of everybody, especially their own bodyguards. They're most frightened of. Look at Putin with that long table now, a 40-yard table, for his own underlings. He's so scared of them. So my point is that Dalai Lama, people do ask him, how come you can be cheerful, Your Holiness, and seemingly remain a happy person and loving and friendly to others and make them feel better, when you're completely hooked up with your duty and your empathy for your Tibetan people who have really been through the ringer for 70 years, 72 years, 73 years now. And how can you do that? And in a way, what it is, he explains it, but to fully explain it, you have to delve a little bit into the esoteric. And people are nervous with that. But in the esoteric, you see, the thing about compassion is, it's so confusing to people that there are a number of people, even Buddhist teachers, who go around saying, oh, compassion is not empathy. Compassion is not empathy. Look out for empathy. You'll get compassion fatigue. You'll be collapsed, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, they're right that empathy alone is not compassion. But empathy is a key wellspring of compassion, actually. It's one of the wellsprings. The other one is a certain wisdom about the nature of reality and the impermanence of the being that you're empathetic about, so that you feel their suffering, yes, but you're not dragged into it in the same way they are, because you realize they have a way out of it. And your compassion is a kind of blissful energy that radiates toward them, which you sort of have to cultivate by seeing the bigger picture about them. You know, it isn't like, in other words, it's like a doctor. It's the successful doctor can mobilize the placebo effect in the patient. Presumably, they'll give good medicine, which will not be poisonous pharmaceutical without bad side effects, but a good medicine, whether herbal or industrial, they'll give it. But they really have a vision, and they can see that health can emerge from within the system of the patient. And there's just this blocking symptom and the blocking bad habit. And they will, so in other words, they will have a confidence in the recovery of the patient. They will see, it's like Ram Dass said to Mark Epstein when he met him after years, when Mark had become a famous psychiatrist. And he said to Mark in Maui there, when they had this chat, that Mark reports, well, it's great you're a psychiatrist now, Mark, right? And Ram Dass had been one. And he's psychologist, psychiatrist. And he said, but let me ask you, do you see your patient as already healed? He said. And then Mark thought about it for a second, and he said, yes, I do. He said. And so then Ram Dass was happy. That was Ram Dass' great achievement, which is true. That's a good doctor. The bad one only sees the disease coming at them and then battles with the disease, and therefore often does things that have side effects that are uncontrollable.
Exactly.
Our medical system is really like that. And the one who has gotten there for fame and glory and profit, who with the wrong motive, will be not such a good doctor in the long run. So compassion, in other words, has a bliss element about it. It has to come from the wisdom of knowing the loving energy in life. That the tree is lovable, that the tree grows out of love, that the Gaia is a loving goddess and bodhisattva. There has to be a vision like that goes with full empathy. So you really can't bear others to suffer. So you therefore naturally won't harm them, and so that's the secret of compassion, is realizing the bliss of life, So in a way, Dalai Lama's being a happy person is his dutiful way of remaining effective in trying to help both the Chinese and the Tibetans locked into this torturer and torturee relationship of trying to genocide them so they can continue to own the land, where the headwaters, which they have no right to own, in international law, they have no right, and in a way, in common environmental morality, they have no right, because everybody from the north of China to Central Asia to Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Bengal, Burma, Thailand, Mekong, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, everybody's headwaters are there on that plateau.
Absolutely.
And really no one of the nation states or pseudo-empires around there has a right to dominate the water sources of all the other people there, because they don't really want their rivers to go dry of the other people and have them becoming refugees into their owning country, right? So the nation-state system cannot manage that plateau, and it has to be disgorged by the Chinese Imperium and made a national park of water source. It's a water tower that everybody needs.
Exactly.
And the international environmental energy and effort and mitigation monies and everything will be paid to restore. I don't know, they got to put air conditioners up there, mini splits to rebuild the glaciers. I don't know how they're going to do it. They really need, we all need to do that.
Well, the drying up of the Himalayan glaciers may be the most catastrophic trigger for mass migration and human suffering in history, because of what you say, the water that comes down out of the Himalaya and the great river systems of
Yeah.
the Yangtze and the Wang and the Mekong and the
Yes.
Brahmaputra and the Indus and the Ganges
Oh,
and so forth and so
yeah.
on. When they dry up,
Exactly.
billions of people will
I
move.
know. You know, I had this dream once that was so amazing. One of those vivid dreams that I don't even, it was so vivid. It's like we're alive in my mind now, but I can't even remember how long ago. If you ask me which decade, I can't even tell you. But in the dream, some sort of mystical beings were telling me that I must link up the highest mountain, sources of all the continents with the Himalayas. In other words, and then I didn't know at the time I had the dream that there is this small club of people who have climbed the highest mountain on each continent. Apparently, ours is in Alaska, the North American continent, and then the Aconcagua in Chile, etc. And there's a small group of people who have climbed all 7 of them. There's one in Antarctica too, right? And I know one wonderful woman who has done that. Because yes, that will be unbelievable when you have 1 billion people becoming climate refugees, because no water between monsoon and the monsoon will be so distorted by then. We will have no idea what the jet stream will be doing, but in the temperate zone. But we don't want all you Californians going. We don't want you all over here in the Hudson River Valley. We don't. I mean, we love you, and we love it when you visit. And we love to visit there, but we want you to save. You want your river coming down from your Sierras in proper style, and replenishing your water table underneath and everything, which can happen if you join the campaign to force the Petropass to cool it.
Totally.
So, Bob, in this decade, we're going to have to do it.
Yeah. So, Bob, let's return to Tibetan Buddha teaching and the Dalai Lama. I'd love to hear you, just because I think it's a fascination for people, that now that the Dalai Lama is coming to the end of his days, there's been much speculation. There's been assertions, apparently, that he has made that he's the last incarnation. There's
no. That's a misunderstanding that people.
How are you understanding this transition that's about ready to come up in the Tibetan Buddhist world?
The Western press and various self-seeking people have misrepresented that.
Yeah, tell us.
When he has said there won't be another Dalai Lama, which he has said occasionally, it's all in terms of the politics, meaning that his reincarnation, which he's always said, is only dependent on people wanting his reincarnation, a reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara. And also, he's not the only one. In the Buddhist belief, the Bodhisattva of supreme compassion, who's actually a Buddha who becomes many Bodhisattvas of compassion, has many incarnations simultaneously in any place, many people, So it's not, but he's the sort of official one that had a 300-year run in being in charge of the governance in a demilitarized Tibet since 1642, actually, in a demilitarized country, which had previously been a highly militarized, effectively conquering country. And so that was a special, contract or charter between, like a Magna Carta, between the Tibetan rulers and the Mongolians, who were always involved with the Tibetan warlords, Tibetan aristocrats, and the Dalai Lama. And so he took on that responsibility. And what he's saying is, democracy is the way of the 21st century, a peaceful, non-World War century that we've got to have, and which he insists that this has to be. And he says, therefore, he will not have responsibility as a governing Dalai Lama. He will be a reincarnation of his own tulku, his own Nirmanakaya, in his monastery. He's already changed the letterhead since 2011, and he has stated in the charter, the constitution of the government in exile, which is intended to be a template for an eventual free Tibet constitution, even if it's a local government under a union of East Asian states, for example, should that be the transition toward true self-determination. But he won't serve in a political role. The Tibetans will have to stop their factionalism and elect somebody, and then have learn the concept of a loyal opposition when you lost, which is necessary to democracy, right? You can't be having campaigns all the time, or that's war. And so that's what he means by the last one. That his prayer, daily prayer and vow that he publicly states at all times is, as long as beings suffer, as beings as many as there is all space, not just on this planet, I will continue to be reborn among them to do my best to help them. That's his prayer. So there's no non-being reborn of the Dalai Lama, reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara, which he seems to really be. He's really walked his talk, and each time they have to relearn, kind of, because they could be, the Nirmanakaya, the body of emanation, which is the Buddhist version of a Jesus thing, except they credit not one father and not one mother, but the sort of nature of the clear light of reality, with many deities involved, but they credit that with the ability to produce many children who intercede for beings to try to help them find heaven, the heaven of lovingness. They have so they multiply that. They're baffled by the idea that there could be a belief that an omnipotent deity would only have one representative, one kid, like a boy who was born in one place, and he wasn't even born a Christian. He was a rabbi, actually. and that's inconceivable to a Buddhist, although even one is great, one is better than none. But the point is, they're not against it. But I'm just saying, they think it's a failure of imagination in a way. And so their idea of Nirmanakaya, of the sort of personal emanations of the ultimate goodness energy that is the spirit of life, they feel that has capable of many people who will start off at a better thing. However, to really help people, the emanation should be among the people and subject to the same temptations and problems of the people, so that they educate themselves in an exemplary way. If they already sort of knew everything in the beginning, didn't have to bother, and they could just root around, which is the fatal mistake a few reincarnations might have made, causing scandals and harmfulness, actually, both in the ancient Asian history as well as in the modern period, where they're scattered around the planet. Just a few bad apples, let's say, not everybody. But the point is, the good ones are the ones who re-educate themselves, who re-inhabit, who work on their delusion, who overcome it, and who become truly loving and therefore non-harmful. And they are kind of true lovingness of all beings, where they're not also molesting them, put it that way. I know what I'm talking about.
And his reincarnation presumably could be just as easily outside of Tibet as inside of Tibet.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. And also, he scared any Tibetan who might still be a male chauvinist, who hasn't gotten the Me Too, it is time notion. He said, and also we need more female leadership now on this planet, because the power of weaponry is such, we can't have leaders immediately, crashing ahead to cortisol-induced violence. We need more oxytocin flowing from the top in societies. So I think I might be a woman in my next incarnation. Oh, no. I might be
that would be a trip. That would be a total experience for the world.
He got really bad press because the Me Too people thought he meant, because then he made a joke. He was in Italy when he first came up with that one. And so he said, and I'll be much more beautiful, therefore, in that life, he said. And he did a fashion gesture, he made like that. But the point is, he didn't mean more beautiful than another woman. He meant more beautiful than his old, aging Dalai Lama male body, he meant. He didn't mean, but it was misunderstood that he was doing some beauty thing and making other ladies feel bad and blah, 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 which he didn't mean it like that at all. But he just was taken that way. So the thing about him is that he's really walked his talk. And I think he's really realized he's had this sort of experience. I actually have him on tape admitting to a penultimate moment in what's called the experience of clear light, which is the Buddhist view of reality, which is not, it doesn't exclude gods, different ones in different nations, notions of what their ultimate reality is, but they feel the ultimate reality is a kind of infinite energy beyond any particular type of personality of either human or animal or, whatever. And that is just the pure goodness. It's the energy of the love energy of the universe. Like which the Gospel of John says, God is love. That's it, And so the Buddhists really do believe that too. That's what nirvana is where when one meets that. And I think he has really met that personally. And apparently the last minute before, in a way, when you meet that, you can't say afterwards, I realized it, I saw it, because you can't see it, because you're made of it yourself. So all you can do is let go and be embraced. And you are the embrace and the embracee. It's a non-dual kind of thing, But they say one of the last minutes is like a flash of lightning that occurs within the dualistic mind. It's like it's something really powerful. I have been admitting to having had a little lightning experience in his heart. I have him on tape, which I taped it in an interview because I derailed the interview to ask him about himself. And he did admit to it, but I've never shown that publicly, but I will eventually. I'm going to put it in a movie. I'm going to make a different movie about him. And so he really, therefore, walked his talk, and therefore the people like him so much, not because he's Tibetan and not because he's a Buddhist, but because subliminally we feel that somebody kind of made it, And ironically, when people meet him, they feel that because they suddenly feel an awareness of somebody who's 100% with them. Rather like you, and you may be like that already. But, for me, you're over there, and I love you. And I love your hair is so great, man. What? You look so good, really. You really do. You look, what I remember, Jim Garrison, when you were a little more pithy, let's say, at an earlier midlife age, you now look so completely sanctified. You really look wonderful, really. But still, to me, you're over there, you see, and I'm over here.
Totally.
If you like me, then I'm over here. But if you meet him, he's over there. He's himself. He doesn't claim anything. But people sort of feel like they feel uplifted. Somebody else is fully, sharing their awareness in a fully accepting way.
Yeah.
Because it's fully empathetic to them. And therefore really focused. My wife is so brilliant. She's so way ahead of me. Really, I'm sort of almost catching up to her. So I'm still a little, but not right yet, but almost. One time, one guy asked us, a very wealthy Indian guy who was a guru chaser, Swami chaser, like miracle, like such as Sai Baba, this kind of thing, producing an Arctic orchid and in the winter and so on. And he said, did you ever see Dalai Lama do a miracle? He says, you've known him for 50 years. This was years ago. It's now almost 60. But he says, ever see? And I don't know what to say. So I'm kind of thinking how to handle this. So my wife, she was at a lunch, so she immediately said, oh, absolutely, many times, she says. And I'm like, I'm with the guy, I'm looking at him, what are you going to say? So then he's leaning forward in his chair. I'm leaning forward. So then she says, well, we've been working with him for 40, 50 years now, and many events we hosted and this and that, and we a lot of stress and all kinds of people who want a piece of him. They want some of his time. They want to blah, blah, blah. She said, and in all of those experiences, which, not all day long, forever, we didn't move to Dharamsala, but many events, I have never seen him not give his full attention to whoever he's confronting him. She said, I've never seen him do that. And that's a miracle, she said. And the guy is really disappointed, doesn't get it. And I loved it. I've chimed in, of course. Absolutely. Although probably I don't fully get it either. But, and people sometimes, and, I just saw him again in October and I broke into tears. People do. And lately he sometimes does. He never used to, but he does sometimes. And because he's like that, but also he did promise to live to 110, originally 113, and then he's downgraded to 110. So not only is he not the last Dalai Lama, but he's going to hang for a while, although, he could fudge out at any time. The last time I met him, because I pinned him down to the 113, actually. Originally it was 103, then went to 113, now it's 110. And then he and I have a fellow student little bit relationship and the different layers of our resilience, depending on how resilient our sense of identity is. And in one layer, we're kind of fellow students on a pick at each other, a little bit. So the minute I pinned him down, and I did that by referring to something he used to tell only the Tibetans about the white Tara longevity meditation, how you can really extend your life with it. And so if you really do it, focus on it. And he told him, his guru had told him on that when he was in Tibet, that he could live to 120. And I said, he used to tell the Tibetans that to keep their spirits up, And so I pinned him down in public in a Western setting on that. And he said, oh, no, that was when I was in Tibet. And then he remembered that he'd done it since he got out. He did the long life pulse with one of the Tibetan physicians, where they do this on the wrists. And the guy said he could do 103. So then when he said that, I said, okay, Your Holiness, it says witnesses, you can do 103. So please stop letting people misunderstand you that you're going to die any minute. And he didn't like me picking on that. So he said, well, if I stay at 103, then you have to stay, he says. How old are you now? I said, well, I'm a few years younger. He said, well, whatever, what would that be? Okay, 97, you have to stay. So then I agreed to try, because I had a grandfather who did make 97, actually. Failed. He kept saying he was going to make 100, but he failed to do that, but he did 97. So we were there. But then next day he showed up. He corralled me as we were getting in a row of limos in Chicago to go to the Field Museum, where he was going to give a talk, and I'm way back in the line. But he ran up to me from his State Department limo, and he said, oh, I had a dream. Not 103. I had a dream that they told me I could make 113. So you have to stay to 107. So it might be just a big joke. No, I don't know. But then later he told that to everybody. And it turned out there was an 18th century Tibetan Lama, Nyingma Lama, who predicted 14th Dalai Lama could make 113. So maybe his dream was somehow connecting to whatever that guy was saying. I don't know why he said 113, but 110 is fine. I'm happy. I'm shooting for 104 too. I am. But he decides to go at 90 or whatever. He claims he's going to have a big conference at 90 of all lamas, and he's going to make a plan for his rebirth, because he has to. Because Chinese are trying to claim they know how to find the rebirth, which is of course total bullshit, but total BS. Excuse me, bleep, total BS, but because, of course, they don't even believe there is such a thing as incarnation, they don't believe that as materialists. So he's going to make a plan, and different people speculate on what the plan is going to be and what the process is going to be. But that doesn't mean he's going to leave, although he does not enjoy, his hearing is not so good. He has a very sore knee. And I'm trying to get him to get a stem cell injection in the knee, and I'm trying to give him my hearing aid, but he won't accept it. Too cheap. It's only a $60 hearing aid, but it works great.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. This has been a delight, and I think it's good that we've ended with some levity, because I always feel that about the Dalai Lama. There's a certain levity and joyfulness to his being that just radiates.
People. I love them. If I ever would try to be a Ramakrishna type of multi-religions, the first place I'd go is Judaism right now. Really, I don't know why. I've found something. I love things out about them, and I really appreciate Rabbi Jesus in a new way. And I would do that, and they are really, but the one thing we have to remember about them, that they should remember about themselves, is they have produced the best comedians in the world. And they have taught the world in the person of Mr. Zelensky that if you're going to have an ex-actor as a head of state in any nation state today, you cannot have a person who is on kind of weird business program. You have to have a comedian, because the comedians engage with the audience, and they cannot be that narcissistic. They can have faults, of course, etc., but they have to get their laughs, so they have to empathize to some extent with the audience,
Yeah, for sure.
So if we pick anybody, in 2024, 2028, who will be an ex-actor and has already name recognition and all this, we've got to.
Remember, we tried that with Reagan, and we tried that with Trump. He
wasn't a comedian. He was a dramatic actor, like fake cowboy. You know what I mean? He wasn't a comedian. And this other guy is not. And the last disaster was not a comedian. He was just firing people as a business guy. So comedians are the only type of theatrical person we should accept in the future. I think Zelensky has taught people, really. As he jokingly says himself, he's the only Jewish Nazi around, just when he's teasing Putin. He is. And I really love the guy. I totally love him. And I have a foreign policy recommendation for him, actually, which is when finally they leave everywhere, I want him to make Crimea into an internationally accessible holiday place. No fleet and no Sebastopol, but it's a holiday place. And then Russians can come without a visa to go to the beach, and real estate will get really valuable, and he will sort of give away to the world, but it'll still be sovereignty from Ukraine, of course, because that's what it was done. But he'll make a gift to the world of a free, beautiful Crimea as a place of joy for all Russians and a place of reconciliation, and all Ukrainians and all Moldovans and all Romanians and everybody around the Black Sea coast there, so they can go to the beach. That's my recommendation for his peace negotiation.
Well, we'll see. We're having a summit all next week, actually, a 5-day program in partnership with Code Pink and a coalition of peace groups around Ukraine to go into this issue much more deeply. But I think what you've offered us, Bob, today is a very deep but fresh and joyful approach to the kind of apology that we need to extend to each other, whether it's in Tibet or Ukraine or the Amazon or in our ordinary daily lives here. Absolutely.
The Algonquians, the Cherokee, the Lakota.
Absolutely.
Out in California, the whatever they are, I forgot the name, wonderful, peaceful people.
Yeah.
You guys are all happier in California. You have to have compassion on all of us New Yorkers or
we have our own issues.
We need you and your happy vibe out there. We really do.
Thank you, Bob, thank you so much. This has been an absolute delight, and I'm deeply grateful, as our whole community is. Thank you so much.
Thank you too. I really love it. And I love it. Please tap me anytime at any of the wonderful things. I love it that you can organize them all. We'd love to work with you jointly at Tibet House Wood in the future, et cetera.
Okay. All right, my friend. Be well. Bye.
You too. You too. All the best.
That's Bob Thurman, great friend, and one of the, I think, treasures of our world. And it was just always an honor being with him over the years, and to have him comment today, I think, has been very important. And so I want to just leave us with this notion of compassion today, and empathy, and a capacity to see the world from the other person's vantage point. We're all the blind people in the elephant. We all have our perspectives, and it's our capacity to honor the multiplicity of perspectives, particularly in a tense situation such as Ukraine or even China and Tibet, that allows us the expansiveness of soul to be compassionate in a way that the Dalai Lama has been compassionate. Extraordinary that he has for many decades now shown such deep compassion for the Chinese without wavering for an instant on his own deep dedication to the liberation of Tibet. So that will bring us to a close, everyone. We'll be focusing on Ukraine all next week. We're going to start the conversation with an extraordinary man who is both Russian and French and American, who speaks both or all three languages completely fluently without an accent, and who has lived in all three countries long enough to be basically a native. And he'll be talking to us about his perception about the situation in Ukraine. His name is Vladimir Posner, and many of you know him. He's very famous in both the United States and in Russia, also in France as one of the preeminent journalists of our time. And he has deep empathy for Western and Russian culture. And we thought that that would be a measured and wise way to start our deliberations. And what we're going to be covering next week is after Vladimir Posner's overview on Monday, we're going to be talking with Daniel Ellsberg on the dangers of nuclear war. We're going to be talking with various people on the costs of war, on how we got here, and the pathway to peace. Jody Evans, the co-founder of Code Red, will be moderating with me all next week. And our focus is going to be on solutions. How do we get ourselves out of this quagmire? And as always, we'll do it in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed. So you will be hearing a variety of perspectives, including Media Benjamin, who's written this very well-researched book on the war in Ukraine, and others, former diplomats, people in Europe, that all of whom care very deeply and will be shedding their perspectives on a situation which, as I said, if we don't resolve, could do damage at a catastrophic level to humanity at this time. So thank you for listening. It's always good to hear from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I was actually born in that part of the world. I was born along the borders of Tibet, right at the moment that the Chinese were invading Tibet. So I have it in my genetic memory, in my soul, the sounds of guns and warfare out of that region. So I've always had a particular fascination and empathy for that part of the world. So thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box, and we'll see you again on Monday for a 5-day program on the war in Ukraine. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.